In July of 2016, a group of intrepid friends traveled to the southwestern corner of Africa to explore one of the most remote and least populated countries of the world. While imbued with a harsh, almost desolate environment, there is no debating its intense natural beauty and the richness of its wildlife, which has somehow successfully adapted to survive in this arid and sparsely vegetated land. But before I recount the details of our fascinating expedition, a quick explanation for why the countryside is the way it is. Its desert conditions are caused by the cold Benguela Current, which runs up along the Namibian coast after having been shaved from the frigid waters circling Antarctica. With the cold waters keeping cloud formations to zero, the country gets almost no precipitation, and thus the coastal Namib Desert and the famous Kalahari further inland have been created. Interestingly, it is sediment being washed down from the Orange River Basin, which drains virtually all of South Africa, that is pushed up the coast to wash ashore in the rough seas and then blown inland to create the country's colorful and iconic sand dunes. So why have so few people heard of Namibia? Well, part of the reason is the country didn't exist before 1990. The desert coastline was ignored by explorers until 1884, when German missionaries arrived and shortly thereafter established a colony called German Southwest Africa. Their rule only lasted until 1915 and was hardly covered in glory, as between 1904 and 07 they committed a genocide of 60,000 local Herero tribespeople, 80% of the total population, and 10,000 Nama tribespeople, over 50% of their total population. This historians now list as the first genocide of the 20th century, and likely the model followed a few decades later in the Nazi Holocaust. Following World War I, the country then became an unwilling protectorate of South Africa, who ruled for 75 years. During this time, the native people continued to be pushed off the best farming and grazing lands in the highlands. On the map, their holdings appear in green, and the growing white settlements are shown in shades of orange. The red dotted line indicates one of the country's few fences, first built to keep hoof-and-mouth disease from the communal tribal lands from infecting herds owned by the whites, and, not surprisingly, it quickly took on racial overtones. In 1990, aided by troops from Angola and Cuba, the country finally won its independence, and today it is a multi-party parliamentarian democracy with English as the official language, although many are more comfortable with Afrikaans or their separate tribal languages. Race relationships appear to be excellent, land reform is progressing under a willing selling, willing buyer basis, and because of its stable politics, low crime, open banking system, and dedication to conservation, it has been touted as the top emerging market on the continent. But having said that, it's a mystery to me how this all came to be, considering their ignominious history. But enough background, let's get on with the adventure itself. This was to be an overland journey, and as is normal for me, wilderness travel did all of the arrangements. We would make a gigantic circle, starting in the capital, Windhoek, and then going north to Etosha National Park. We stopped en route at a private game reserve called Okunjima, and after a day looping through the park, we'd turn west and down to visit the Himba people of Damaraland before continuing on to the coastal resort town of Swakopmund. From there, a flight took us across the Namib Desert to the famous Sousasvlei Dunes. We ended with a few nights hiking and camping under the stars on the Toki Trail before circling back to Windhoek and the end of our trip. I have no idea how many miles we drove, but considering that the country is twice the size of California, that we got to see a significant part of it, and that most of the roads were dirt, we certainly did our share. I don't remember California having signs like this, though. A few hours north of Windhoek, our first stop was at the Okunjima Nature Reserve. We were immediately wowed by how luxurious our accommodations were. In addition to an elegant lounge and dining area, which overlooked a small waterhole, there were 8 spacious thatched-roofed chalets, each with semi-detached open-air private lounges of their own. While we were accompanied throughout the trip by 2 talented driver guides, more on them in a short bit, For our exploration of Okonjima, we shifted into two open-air land cruisers with local guides provided by the reserve. The reason for this is that Okonjima is home to the Africat Foundation, which uses the 55,000-acre reserve to rehabilitate a variety of carnivorous predators that have either been injured or orphaned by irate livestock farmers.
And sometimes we just stand up out of a bush and we can't see them. I mean, they are very well camouflaged. Don't panic and go in all directions, okay? Stay nice and calm.
From morning to night, you work out the go. All man you go, Sabio, because of money.
The foundation has been able to successfully return 86% of the almost 1,100 animals who have been brought to them by ranchers from throughout Namibia. A few, who have been designated as problem animals and will live out their lives on the reserve, are radio-collared and work for their supper, as it were, by entertaining visitors like ourselves. Having said that, it proved to be no small feat to find this leopard hidden in the brush, as he was amazingly camouflaged, and the guides began wondering if the radio collar might not just have fallen off. And, as with all great days on safari, as the sun drops close to the horizon, you search out a good place to pull over, pour the sundowner of your choice, and relive some of the day's many highlights. On this particular evening, we then paid a brief visit to the camp's blind, where we got a great view of a honey badger and several impressive porcupines who are nocturnal and normally hard to see.
Getting crazy.
Next stop, famous Etosha National Park. But before we get there, I think a little further discussion of the rivers of southern Africa provides good insights into the region. The principal and most famous river is the Zambezi. It begins in Angola near its border with the Congo, comes down through Zambia to join with the Chobe River near Victoria Falls. It then continues through a series of Great Lakes before finally reaching the Indian Ocean via Mozambique. The Germans thought access to the Zambezi would be critical, and in 1890 Count Leon Caprivi traded the entire island of Zanzibar to the British for a thin slice of land now called the Caprivi Strip. Unfortunately, he never realized that Victoria Falls made the Zambezi unnavigable. To the west of these two rivers are two additional ones that drain eastward from the Angolan highlands, the Quito and the Okavango, which, instead of exiting to the sea as you would normally think, end in a delta in the Kalahari Desert where the water simply evaporates. At some point, thousands of years ago, when the water flow was such that the Okavango ended in an enormous lake greater than the size of Switzerland, but now that the flow is much smaller, the lake is gone, and what is left is the delta and a series of salt pans called Makgat-ik-Gadi. Easy for me to say. This same dynamic is what created the Etosha Pan in Namibia. For a long time there was a debate whether the Okavango used to first flow to Etosha before doubling back to the Kalahari, but extensive studies have now shown that it was the Kunene River that created Etosha before changing its path and flowing west to the Atlantic. Today, Etosha is a vast, desolate expanse covering almost 2,000 square miles, but it seems to be a magnet for wildlife attracted by the numerous underground springs that have created a series of natural waterholes surrounding the pan. In addition, because of drought, in recent years the park has drilled a number of boreholes and with pumps now supplements the water flow. The animals don't seem to go out onto the pan itself except to take advantage of some nearby salt licks, but they love hanging out on its periphery, where they enjoy a mix of sparse grasslands, mopane forests, and of course water. It was pretty dry when we were here in July, but supposedly every few years, usually in January or February, it will flood with up to a few inches of water, and the bird life comes in from everywhere to enjoy it. We spent an entire day driving around the southeastern part of the park, and I was struck by how easy it was to see a huge amount of wildlife simply by hanging out at each waterhole, and this included the undisputed crowd favorite, elephants.
Oh my gosh. Keep coming. Oh, he's hauling butt. The lions are checking it out.
Now they're moving. to flank them.
There they go. Yeah.
Ooh,
That's so cool.
That's a nice picture. Dust.
Look at the big one. He's getting pissed.
That's beautiful.
He's like,
Here comes the other one now.
oh, wow.
We traveled in 2 Land Cruisers that were air-conditioned and surprisingly comfortable considering the rough roads. We each had a window seat, plenty of legroom, and a roof hatch that was easily closed when there was dust or open to enjoy the sights. I think I'll use this moment to finally introduce the participants in our fine adventure. First off, there were our longtime friends Ed and Leslie. Ed normally only joins me on one of my boys' trips, but Leslie regularly joins Barb and I on many of our other adventures. There was Nancy, an old friend from our Palo Alto days, a horticulturalist. She had an absolute field day in Namibia. Then there was my golf buddy Shelley. This was the first trip of this sort I had done with him, and I think he was originally skeptical. But his wife Peggy, who everyone quickly came to love, absolutely loved the experience, so he's stuck with us now. In addition, we were joined by some new friends who were veteran wilderness travelers. Melinda is originally from Berkeley. She's a school teacher now retired to sunny Arizona. And Bob, a retired stamp dealer who lives in Florida where he maintains an active career as a baseball umpire. Of course, there was my darling bride, Barb, who delights in these trips, and me, who appears several times in the show thanks to the excellent photo efforts of Shelley. And finally, there were our 2 naturalist guides who seemingly knew the backstory to every animal or insect we saw along the way. Great travel companions, they were excellent drivers and easily kept us organized without feeling rushed. Our 2 nights in the Etosha area were spent at a somewhat rustic but still delightfully furnished lodge with tented cabins along with some intriguing walls made of rocks covered with chicken wire.
Thank you for making this for me. What's for everybody else? What do they have?
Etosha National Park was the furthest north we went on our trip, and it definitely proved to be the most intensive wildlife portion of the journey. This was especially true when it came to elephants, and they seemed to dominate all the water holes as we drove to the park's western exit. By the way, this rest stop with a viewing platform built alongside a waterhole is on the site of a culling station where in 1980 and 81 a controversial park superintendent had 525 elephants winched up and butchered for bone meal before he was relieved of his duties. Once the elephants are through drinking, and some even taking a short nap, they normally would wet themselves and then take a good dust bath. This both makes a good sunblock and keeps insects away. We exited Etosha Park near sunset and stayed nearby in a simple but quite comfortable lodge. After enjoying a great meal, we then headed out on a fantastic night drive where we seemed to just encounter one animal after another after another. This lion, hanging out no more than 50 yards from the lodge, should cure anyone of the idea of wandering around at night on your own. The next morning we woke early and hit the road traveling south into an area called Damaraland. We began passing a number of small farms and settlements where the local Herero tribespeople subsist by herding goats and cattle and growing small plots of corn and grain. Stopping for gas, we got a chance to look at the interesting rigs Afrikaners use on their self-drive vacations. A standoffish lot, predisposed to assume you think poorly of them. The minute you ask about their trailers, they light up and become much more friendly. Leaving the roads behind us, we headed off along a bumpy track that wove in and out of a small river basin up into the hills of Keukenveld. Here we visited a small village of semi-nomadic Himba people. The Himba are predominantly livestock farmers, and the men are often away with their cattle for extended periods. This village, because of the difficulty of getting to it, is only visited by a nearby lodge and Wilderness Travel's local ground operator. Because of this, they were familiar with what to expect, but were still unjaded and seemed quite friendly and happy to have us visiting. The Himba women are fiercely proud of their traditions. Their dreadlocks are created using a wide variety of possible things, most commonly okra, butter, and goat hair. The black leather ornamental top piece indicates she is a mother. Their beaded anklets protect against snake bites, but also are a favorite spot to hide money. The large white shell necklace is called ohumba, and is a traditional gift from mother to daughter. It has to be said that Himba women don't wear a lot of clothes. Instead, they cover themselves with a mixture of okra and butterfat, which adds a color to their skin that they consider a sign of beauty, and at the same time acts as a sunscreen and insect repellent, not unlike the adaptation to this harsh climate of the elephants we saw earlier. The men also wear their hair in dreadlocks, in their case one single artistic statement, but we never saw one, for the minute they marry they cover their heads in a small turban, which is supposedly never ever removed until there's a death in the family. Toward the end of our visit, they set up a small market and, in a very low-key, non-pressured way, offered us a variety of handicrafts, and finally we were treated to a demonstration of their traditional line dancing. Looking around, I found it amazing how most of the girls wore the headpieces indicating they were mothers, including many that looked no more than 14 years old.
Oh, there we go.
That's what they're waiting for. I put 100 in. I put 200 in.
Leaving the Himbas, we drove down out of the highlands to the Abahwab Valley and checked into one of the most delightful lodges imaginable. Camp Kipwe is tucked in among dramatic granite boulders and offers 9 extremely comfortable bungalows designed to blend in and even give you the sensation of living inside one of the boulders. That evening, we walked to the top of the adjacent hill and enjoyed a sundowner as we looked down over the valley floor. Next morning, we headed out in search of desert elephants, but it proved to be more difficult than one might think despite their being such a large animal. While they do most of their long-distance travel during the cool of the night, during the day they stick to the seasonal riverbeds, which offer a modicum of shade and food. After searching for quite a while, we finally found fresh tracks.
Yeah, it's still a little bit hot, yeah?
For the record, Usko was just playing with us. He was actually switching fingers as he brought it to his mouth. Before he let us in on the joke, he encouraged everyone to follow his example, but not surprisingly, no one was very eager. It turns out they're not a different species than what we saw in Etosha, but because their terrain is lower and hotter, and with long expanses of sand between river valleys, the families living here have adapted with longer legs, larger feet, and an ability to go up to 3 days without water. And, as we saw, they move fast. Then, that same afternoon, we visited Namibia's first World Heritage Site, Fontaine. Here, a sandstone cliff face has fractured along natural fissures, dropping large rocks with flat, smooth surfaces, perfect canvases for prehistoric artists, and over 2,500 pictographs have been found here, all made between 3,000 and 6,000 years ago.
That ostrich dance that you did? Can you do a little more?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Beautiful. Perfect. Thank you.
It's a pressure.
Most of the pictographs were likely made by shamans praying for good hunting. This famous one of a lion with prey in its mouth and with human feet and a hand at the end of its tail depicts the shaman in his trance, having become the lion itself. And so, following a long but great day, we returned for our final night at Camp Kipwe.
Hey, Bob, we're so glad you came. With your wit, your stories, and your charm. We hope you have
The beginning of another day with yet another delightful breakfast. You definitely run the risk of gaining weight on a trip like this. Then a short stop to take in a bit more of the local geological attractions, and we were off, driving southwest towards the Skeleton Coast, renowned for being one of the most dangerous coastlines in the world and graveyard to untold numbers of ships. The entire coastline of Namibia has been turned into national parks, and we'll explore it more in the upcoming and final Part 3. The beach town of Swakopmund provided a slightly bizarre break in the middle of our journey. While certainly quite pleasant, it felt like some strange combination of a German village and a town in the Australian outback, spirited away from its proper setting and dropped without rhyme or reason in this remote stretch of African coast like a desert oasis mirage. Whatever the case, it provided a pleasant break, and we enjoyed a comfortable, centrally located hotel from which to explore independently. I have to say, however, after experiencing an impressive dust storm that next morning, I stopped checking prices at the local real estate offices. Thankfully, the skies did clear, and by early afternoon we were off, flying in 2 small planes south along the Skeleton Coast, while Bob and Shelley, who had left that morning, accompanied our guides on the drive to meet us in Sossusvlei. It was definitely quite the scenic trip, as we flew over salt flats with hundreds of flamingos and along a stretch of beach with shipwrecks and large colonies of sea lions. As we moved inland, we came across older shipwrecks which were now quite a ways from the shoreline, and the ruins of old diamond mining camps, which, although no longer active, are still kept off limits to any visitors. At a certain point, we left the coast completely and headed east across the sandy expanses of the Namib Desert to the Sesriem Valley. Arriving at a primitive landing strip in the middle of nowhere, we were met as planned by the vehicles and headed to a nearby lodge. By this point, we had become accustomed to how fabulously beautiful Namibia's supposedly rustic lodges could be.
I'm Barbara.
Nice to meet you. Please go.
Thank you.
Nancy, nice. Something cold to drink? We've already organized the lunch.
In this case, there was a large central thatched main lodge and dining facility with individual tented suites, all with panoramic views looking west over the desert. As you can see, it was a tough life, but heck, you've just got to man up when the going gets rough.
Where are you guys?
We are in Susuvlei.
And of course, no day on safari can be considered complete until you go on a late game drive and stop at a scenic point for the requisite sundowner. That next morning, bright and early, we were off, on our way to experience Namibia's most iconic attraction, the amazing sand dunes of Sossusvlei. Sossusvlei, which roughly translates as dead-end marsh, actually refers to the valley floor, which was created by the ephemeral Swatchab River. By ephemeral, they mean it only once in a great while has any water, but the cumulative effect of those rare occasions is that a valley was cut several miles into the Namib desert before dying at what's called Deadvlei. Over the millennia, the valley floor has formed a hard clay pan covered with a crust of salt-rich sand. And in this NASA satellite photo, you can see how this has provided access to a great number of dunes, including Big Daddy, which at 1,067 feet is likely the tallest sand dune in the world. Proceeding southward along the eastern fringe of the Namib Desert, we enjoyed a scenic drive through expansive sandy plains alternating with jagged mountain peaks. At one time this had been sheep farming country, but in 1984 one of the local ranchers convinced his neighbors to join forces and take down their fences, reintroduce wildlife, and allow the land to return to its original state. And with that, the 2,000 square kilometer Namibran Nature Reserve was born. While the number of visitors to the reserve is strictly limited, the scenery is glorious, and there are numerous activities possible, from horseback safaris to a hiking route called the Toktoki Trail, which is what we did. For the hike, we were met by a local guide named Sebastian, who was truly extraordinary. He had been a colleague of Usko and Ronnie's, but as a newly married man, he had tired of being away from home for long periods of time and decided to take this position at Toktoki. In addition to being simply a lot of fun to be with, he had a wonderful way of bringing all of the little inhabitants of the desert to life and making their lives seem completely fascinating. As dusk approached, we arrived at our home for the next 2 nights, a camp truly under the stars. Yes, this means not even a tent, but we were hardly roughing it. A chef had preceded us and had our meal well underway by the time we arrived. What was left was for us to enjoy some cocktails and the sunset before sitting down for dinner once the sun had set. We awoke to a glorious morning after a night spent inside toasty Australian-style swags. These are essentially a duvet blanket with sheets and pillow inside a heavy canvas outer bag. And then we were off, with Sebastian pointing out all the little things along the way, including this community nest built by sociable weavers.
And the female, if they are for some reason not happy, they can actually rip this nest apart, pulling grass up. And the male has to, rebuild.
Why is that not surprising?
Yeah.
There were also these enigmatic fairy circles, which are only found in reserve and were just recently proven to be caused by a particular species of sand termites. An example from his bag of leader tricks was bringing along a powerful magnet to demonstrate how many tiny particles of iron occurs in the Namib sand. Then we climbed to the one pass we would cross on our hike. At the top, we took a break to enjoy the view, pose for a few pictures, and have a snack. And just about the time we were beginning to feel like, wow, this is getting to be a good long hike, and the day is starting to get a little bit warmer, we just happened to come upon a tent stocked with cold drinks and snacks, and we whiled away the next hour or two napping, playing crosswords, chatting, while magically the heat abated. The desert light once again became magical, and we sauntered back to camp. That next morning, the sharply angled early light across the desert once again made it a photographer's treat. It suddenly occurred to me how clever the design of our stay had been. One day of hiking bookended with a glorious evening hike, and this our final short morning hike back to the roadhead. And each evening we were treated to an extraordinary star show, as this is one of the world's premier dark sky preserves. Interestingly, after a rich and incredibly varied adventure, with great wildlife viewing, fascinating cultural encounters, dramatic scenery, fantastic lodging and meals, these simple days in Tuktoki were in many ways everyone's favorite, the icing on a fabulous cake. I heartily urge you to follow in our footsteps.